Assalamualaikum. So this is going to be a case study analysis for the case by Harvard Business Review called Cisco Systems Incorporated Implementing ERP. Technically, this is a series of cases, and the one that we are specifically focusing on is Cisco Systems implementation of their ERP system, which is Enterprise Resource Planning System. So let's look at a brief synopsis of the entire case first, then we'll break it down and analyze it. So the synopsis goes thus. Pete Solvik, who actually started as the CIO of Cisco Systems in '93, started to work with a company that had around a $5 million it was a company which was worth about $500 million at that point in time, but the software that they were running specifically for their core transaction processing, which is because Cisco is a networking company, it's a networking giant, basically the world leader when it comes to networking products. So they were running really outdated software packages, and more specifically the software packages that they had that were dealing with their transaction processing were extremely outdated. So Solvik actually realized that he needed to make a change. He needed to improve the application or to replace it because the current one was unstable. However, he also understood that that the company could not afford to actually have the flexibility to improve without having this software change. So he was in a dilemma. He had to make this change happen, otherwise the company would actually run into the ground. So Solvik's instinct was to first to avoid the ERP, because an ERP, as we will talk about later, is a very huge task. It causes a lot of changes throughout the organization. So he was actually going with the presumption that it would be far too risky to get an ERP implementation. He was therefore thinking of doing something else, to just get another transaction processing system and just get away with it. So in January 1994, the company's system, the legacy system or the system that they were already using, failed so badly that there was no way that they could go ahead with anything after that. They had to do something about it. So Cisco decided that they needed to implement an ERP completely throughout their organization, and they needed to do it really quickly. So in the planning stage, Cisco actually went around and looked at a lot of ERP options. The selection team actually spent about 10 days to create what are known as requests for proposals or RFPs. These are documents that are sent to different vendors with details of what you need, and then the vendors, who are basically companies that will be offering you their ERP solutions, give you the responses, and then you go through the vetting process of evaluating those responses and then choosing one of those companies for your actual implementation. So Cisco invited these respondents to come up with their solutions and to give a demo, asking them to actually meet Cisco's requirements. So after a 75-day long selection process, it was Oracle, which is the giant when it comes to ERPs. It's the second largest ERP solution provider right now as of 2021. The first one being SAP, the second being Oracle, the third being Microsoft. So Oracle won the contract, and Solvik and his team his team was given the presentation for this implementation. It was going to be a project that cost them eventually $50 million and was the largest capital project at that point in time for that company. Now, after the approval from the board of directors, Cisco immediately started the project and they asked the implementation to go ahead with it. The team was composed of around 100 people. That was a cross section of all the people that were working in Cisco. So different departments, different functional areas, and they were all divided into 5 tracks, or you could think of them as process area teams, people that were from different domains within within Cisco. And it also included several other people, which included Cisco's business leader, their own business leader, the business consultants that came in from either KPMG, which was their consulting company, and Oracle itself, plus other additional leaders from other departments and other teams. So the entire project was actually overseen by a steering committee, which is how most projects go, and it comprised of senior level Cisco executives as well as the partners in charge of West Coast Consulting for KPMG. So anyways, the implementation team actually employed a development technique that is known as rapid iterative prototyping, which means you basically constantly come up with newer solutions to a problem. You show it to the possible users, and then you come up and whatever suggestions they recommend given to you, you go back to the drawing board, you do it again, and you come back again. So it's referred to as a rapid iterative prototyping process, or this is opposed to the waterfall method, which goes step by step, that we generally have discussed in other cases. So the implementation process was actually broken down into different phases, and each of these phases was referred to as a CRP, or a conference room pilot. So every time they would come with a pilot project, they would present it to the group, and then the group or the group of users, or even the steering committee, would then evaluate it. They would point out the things that they thought are good enough and the others that they needed to be improved. Then the development team, the implementation team, would go back to the drawing board, come up with a new iteration, and then do the same thing again. So CRP 0 was completed with the demonstration of the software's capacity to handle the entire order that Cisco would receive, from the quotation given to a customer all the way to receiving of the cash and handing over of the device that we are selling. So that was the first portion. This was basically making sure that one actual transaction could be completed. That was CRP 0. CRP 1 was the case where each track made the system work for their own specific area. And to remind you again, tracks are different functional areas, and they documented all the problems that they received. So during the weekly 3-hour meetings, track leaders from each area would sit together and would find solutions. Now the implementation became more challenging as they reached CRP 2, because the technical issues started showing up there, and CRP 3's focus, which was to test the entire system in its entirety, not just one receiving of a particular order, but rather the entire system, was the one where they faced the biggest challenges. So each team member simulated an entire day's worth of actual work and actual business data, and once they realized that this was being handled perfectly well, they went ahead to continue with their project further on with the further stages. So that's how it actually went. So during the next 5 months, the implementation team faced some of the most difficult times. However, in the end, Cisco was able, and its implementation team and the vendors, representatives, as well as the consultants, were able to finally bring the system to its full working condition. Solvik and their team actually managed to implement the entire system within 9 months, which is a huge achievement, which technically generally doesn't happen, and it cost them $50 million, which we'll discuss later, was actually more than what they were hoping to spend. So did Solvik make the right decisions? Did it actually create a difference between success and failure, or were they just lucky? Let's look at it now. So the entire purpose of teaching this case, first you need to understand that, to be able to better understand why you're reading this case. So it is what is referred to as a best practices case, because it's telling you how an ERP implementation or an enterprise information system technology implementation happens. So this is supposed to teach you how the best practices are implemented in different big shot tech companies. So the primary purpose is to understand what Cisco did right in this entire thing, and also to demonstrate the mistakes made by their company, because this was the expectation that Cisco executives also had. They had some expectations from the ERP project, and they needed to be clear about it, which they weren't, and they also weren't so clear about the problems that their company was already facing, so that ERP would then come in and replace it. However, they were hoping to find someone within their ranks to actually stand up and take over the whole project and handle it. However, no volunteer showed up, and Cisco eventually had to initiate the project themselves and lead the project themselves in a very centralized manner, which is not really recommended. So this initial misperception that people wanted to get the change happening within the organization was what led to a lot of problems, especially in cases of enterprise level IT projects. If you recall, we discussed this in the first cases readings before the midterms, that sometimes the company's higher ups need to take the heavy-handed approach. This is an example of that, where they had to step in because nobody was willing to step in. So the case's main teaching ideas is to understand that there is always a set of best practices for managing such IT projects that are enterprise-wide, especially those in such as ERP's implementation, because those are all about getting the best practices in an industry into your organization, which requires you to change the way that you're doing your things. So Cisco's approaches in these areas are actually considered to be exemplary, and they're amazing, and they need to be understood by students as an example that other companies should follow. Students should also understand that people know Cisco as a networking company, but they don't realize that Cisco's this particular case of implementing an ERP is an amazing thing to study. The second objective is to understand why most managers of these different organizations such as Cisco would be so reluctant in trying to implement a new ERP system. Reason being that they're resistant to it because obviously it's going to change everything, and most people face what is referred to as change inertia, so they don't wish to change, and it obviously reveals the failings of the managers, and therefore that's why they're going to resist. The third important point that this case will be discussing and will be covering is why ERP success is so characterized by having a top-down centralized approach instead of having a bottoms-up approach. That's because the kind of implementation that ERP requires is not just the software being installed, but rather changing the mindsets of the people to basically do their work in a very different manner. So this case actually exposes the shortcoming of this entire argument that perhaps that is just a matter of implementing the software. It's actually a matter of changing the way that people do things. Number 4, they also are going to be discussing during the entire case, we are also discussing the trade-offs that happen when you're implementing an enterprise level IT and doing it in a slow, gradual manner. Sometimes you just can't afford to do that. Sometimes you have to speed it up. So these are the 3 or 4 things that this case will be covering. So let's look at the analysis of the case itself. So Cisco's initial approach to the IT decision making, as it was described earlier that I talked about, is that they attempted to let the functional areas within the company make their own decisions about what applications and software they would buy. That's what they were doing earlier on, and how to implement them. Under this model, Solvik and his IT organization was responsible for integrating each of these applications in the overall IT infrastructure of Cisco, and sometimes they would also have to veto these decisions. However, they would not dictate the entire information system's choice or even the timing with which these implementations would happen. Solvik felt that this poorly functioning old system that we talked about in the case is good enough for these managers to take decisions about and to change it. However, that didn't happen. This kind of approach just didn't work. Cisco experienced a complete disaster in '93 after their entire system completely failed, and it actually stopped functioning. There was just no way that orders could be handled. So no functional manager at that point in time came forward and said, okay, this is what we should be implementing. The major reason for this kind of inertia, this kind of holdover from the managers, was because the decision making process was made in such a manner. These functional areas this approach of letting everyone decide on their own just did not work, because everybody was looking at their own silos instead of looking at the whole organization. So as a result, the company had to completely abandon this, and the higher ups had to go for an ERP implementation. People, whenever they're reading this case, do not understand the importance of just this little point. This is not such a small point. This is actually a huge issue, that this autocratic implementation had to be done because they had to abandon their previous form. True enough that it should always be from a bottoms-up approach, but sometimes you just need to do that. So people tend to ignore this very basic problem, that whenever you're implementing an enterprise level technology like ERP, which goes across all of these functional and organizational boundaries, sometimes the managers are not going to like it, and they're not going to be willing to step up and implement it across the organization. And sometimes the only solution is for the higher ups to actually have a heavy-handed approach and get it implemented. So Cisco got it right because of the way that they implemented, and they may look at the entire thing as a success story completely, which it isn't. What they miss out is that Cisco already made a huge mistake earlier on, and they rectified it, yes, but they did make that mistake. So general managers and ERP, how does that usually work? So it can be very difficult to understand why functional managers would not be willing to have an ERP implementation. And as I said earlier, that's because they resist these changes, because what ERP really changes is the business processes, not the technology, not the software. What it really changes is the business process. Nobody likes to change the way that they're doing their jobs, because whenever this happens, whenever this implementation happens, there is a dip in performance. That is bound to happen, and organizations just don't want that. And functional managers, who are supposedly expected to be answerable for their performances, don't like that, because they don't want that dip to happen. But sometimes it's inevitable. Secondly, and this is the more important point, it is simply not true that most functional managers are going to have an ambiguously improved IT environment after ERP actually happens. In other words, ERP is not going to improve everybody's job. Sometimes that may not be the case. That is because the new system is not designed or configured with them in mind. It's designed based on the best practices of the industry. So they may not be okay with the new system and they may not even perform well because they have to learn the new system. So the new system, the new transaction, new business process is going to change everything. So this is why that's the case. So some groups are going to lose the information system that they like, that they were working on. So, and some would get new system that they have to learn. So in other words, the legacy system is like a spaghetti, that is just undesirable for the company, and now they don't want strands of spaghetti. They want this whole integrated, really good system. So, and then lastly, each group's request for ERP customizations will become a problem because everybody wants it to be like their old system, and that is something that you got to resist. These managers would want changes, but these changes cannot be implemented because if that's the Pandora's box we open up, then the ERP's actual purpose would just die out, because the actual purpose is to bring in that change, that organizational business process re-engineering, that actual change and that alignment with the best practices of the industry, not just the software. So that's something that these managers don't want. They tend to prefer to customize the new software to become almost like the old one, and that's why they resist. So leading the implementation is also an issue. As mentioned, the functional managers were just resistant to the entire project, and therefore they were unwilling to volunteer for the project. And this is due to the large mismatch between the risks and the reward. There was a huge risk in this implementation actually working out. No senior manager wants to take it on their heads. If it fails, they'll be the one taking the fall for it. So this entire enterprise IT implementation, if it would have failed, then it would be a disaster. Already discussed the performance dip that was bound to happen, and it did happen after ERP, but that doesn't mean that the organization failed to implement the ERP. That was going to happen. That happens in any case. If you recall the reading ABCs of ERP, that is one of the most seminal readings on ERP implementations. You should definitely read that if you haven't. So if you read that, that's what it talks about, that every time you're going to go ahead and implement an EIT, an enterprise IT solution like ERPs, you will get that dip, because there will be a time period where you will have to learn new systems, and that always takes a little while. For all these reasons, the cut over to the new system will be a jarring event. This will be like a new thing. There'll be this jerk that happens, after which you will switch to the new system. So the performance dip is bound to happen. It doesn't mean that the ERP failed, it just means that you need a little time to get it starting. That's like new shoes or like a new car. It takes a little while for you to get the hang of it. So another issue that we look at in this analysis is the fact that there was a huge emphasis on the speed with which the implementation happened, and instead of the analysis or the very slow gradual implementation, they had to do it quickly because they did not have enough time. So Cisco took a more iterative approach. As I mentioned earlier, they used the iterative model of implementation, or rapid iterative model, and they created conference room pilots, which is where every project, every step would be completed, and the next step would start up of the whole implementation process after getting input from people. So Cisco believed that the speed and iteration were positively linked with this kind of project. That is one way to do it. But remember that this is very different from how other organizations did, and we will look at Vanderly, which did it differently, which is another case separately. Or if you were to look at how Webvan, which is a case that was taught to you in e-commerce, did it too. They didn't do the iterative design. They went on with what is known as a slam dunk or a big bang approach, where they changed the entire project immediately. Another entire theme throughout the case is whether they were smart or they were actually lucky. Now, Cisco's emphasis on speed may have worked here for various reasons, because they had no choice in everything, but that is not what is always advisable. So they got lucky with the way they did it, and they might have completely screwed it up, but they did it. So if you were to look at the fact that them moving quickly was whether or not it was a smart thing, they kind of did get lucky with Oracle's good system and everything. Otherwise, it's not always suggested. So was Cisco very sensible with its configuration of the ERP implementation? Yes, they were. They did do a lot of things right, and we will review them in a while. So changing the system or changing the process, always remember that whenever you are bringing in ERP, you are not going to be changing the system. You're actually there changing the process. You cannot get the off-the-shelf ERP and get it to work with everything. Yes, you will need to configure and change a few things as bare minimum as possible, but the whole point of an ERP is to bring in the right new kind of processes, the better business practices. That is what you're trying to achieve. So many ERP customers, including Cisco, understood that this changing ERP software was difficult. Why? Because if you change the system that you're implementing, the new upgrades would require you to change them again. Right? So if you implement an ERP, you're trying to get the best practices of the industry into your organization. Now eventually, when the ERP is upgraded or updated by the company itself, you will need to implement the changes again in the updated version, which is very expensive. So modifying the software is always discouraged in the case of ERPs. The whole idea is to use the ERP as is and implement that and basically learn from it. So that's essentially what we're looking at. So how do you succeed in an ERP implementation? Let's look at a list. This is probably the crux of the case. Make sure that you put the best people on the project. That goes without saying, but that is something that organizations often ignore. They're like, let's put them to production, let's keep them working there. But no, Cisco did that right. They put their very best people in the implementation project. They picked the hand-picked people from different departments and created their cross-functional teams. Number two, make sure that you give it a lot of managerial attention. This is not a project that could be like a side project for the organization. This is your core. This is going to be your sustainable competitive advantage. This is essential. So you can't just like keep it as a side project. This is your major thing. The entire upper management support and attention needs to be focused on this. Then, and this is probably the theme that I'll be repeating over and over again, is to change the process, not the software. Understand that when you're implementing an ERP, notice that it's not using the word installing the ERP, it's implementation of ERP. You are changing the business processes. You're bringing in new best processes, because ERPs are created based on the best practices of their particular industries, whichever module you're using. So if you're implementing it, you're changing the process, not just changing the software. Very important to understand. Focus on speed, not the analysis. We'll be discussing this again, that that the focus should be on not analyzing it but implementation speed. Iterate it rapidly. This is something that did. Iteration always helps, because then you can immediately learn what is wrong with the system and improve it. Make it a company-wide priority. Don't just do it in one particular functional area or a couple of departments. Do it throughout the organization. This is important because this is the only way to get through with the inertia. If you only do it for a couple of departments, they may also lose the motivation to change. You need to kind of do it for the entire organization. And besides, the whole point of an ERP system is to create one single integrated solution. If you do not do it company-wide, it loses its point. It's pointless. Crisis can always help, because that is an element of change management. Because if you create a strong enough crisis, which happened in this case because the organization's software just stopped working, so crisis always convinces people to get along and actually do the thing, right? Smart partnering and good contracts, finding the right consultants, finding the right companies to work with, finding the right software vendor to work with is a huge advantage. And sometimes ERP projects only fail because you identify the wrong vendor, or you just don't have the right consultants. That's also an important thing. ERP is a high IT priority. Another element that people tend to ignore is that ERPs are, of course, IT projects. So they must be a priority of the IT department. If the company's IT organization was and must be fully engrossed in this project, they need to be involved completely. It cannot be something that they just involved in partially into. So they need to be involved just as much as the top management. Those are the important elements that need to be added. So this is essentially the major breakdown of this entire case. Now we need to look at the different elements, the different issues that they went through one by one. Let's look at those. Okay, so what they did was, I've already discussed the background, so I won't go through that again. Let's look at the entire concept. Now, the whole point of an ERP is something that we've already discussed in various other readings, so I won't go through that. But why did they get the ERP in this scenario? People tend to think it's just a matter of just getting an old system out and a new system in. No, it's much more than that. ERP implementation has its own needs. The point is to bring in an integration of the entire organization systems and to make everything work together. So there were some ERP implementation success factors that Cisco looked at. So these success factors that they mentioned in the case 2 that are important, and whether and they can be replicable in other scenarios similar to the Cisco's, are: number 1, putting the best people on the team. It is a huge success factor and it is easily replicable. Every organization can do it. Number 2, can-do team attitude. That is also what differentiates a failure from a success. You need to have a can-do attitude of those people. It goes without saying that if they assume that this can't work, it will never work. So is this replicable? Depends. Some organizations may have teams that are just not willing to believe that. So is this a replicable KPI? Maybe. It might be. Top management's commitment, definitely replicable and is a huge success factor. Middle management's commitment, Another element that may or may not be replicable in another organization, but it is a success factor. It should another element that is a major success factor is the high priority given to an ERP implementation project in any company, and it is replicable. Anybody can do that. Rapid implementation schedule. This is a success factor or not is debatable, because maybe, and for most cases it should not be hurried up to that point. It should be taken slowly and gradually. Again, Cisco had to do it because they had no choice. However, is this a replicable thing? Yes, but it depends on the organization whether or not they should go with the same speed that Cisco did. 9 months is a very small time period for doing something like that. So should they go for a big bang approach or a phased approach? Big bang means doing it throughout the organization, the same go, or should be doing it phase wise. This is completely dependent on the organization. Some organizations may prefer to go ahead in phases because their work or their projects or whatever their business is far too mission critical for it to happen. Because if you do a big bang approach, you might create a huge disaster, because if it doesn't work out and if people are unwilling to accept it, you have no other way to go back, and that may create a major performance dip. However, phased approach has its own flaws. Problem is, if you do a phased approach, people may not be willing to accept the new system because they know that there's a fallback option to the older system. Rapid iterative prototyping to build knowledge. Yes, as I said, doing the iterative method is a good idea, but doing it with this speed is not such a great idea. So doing the iterative prototyping method, where you create or solve or implement it in a smaller area, or do it for one entire functional process and then go back to the drawing board after you get user input, then the next iteration, which means the next phase, and so on and so forth. Having an initial no modification strategy, which means not changing anything unless it's absolutely necessary. This is very important, and this is something that every organization can replicate. It is a huge success factor, because you must understand that the ERP is here to change the way that the organization does its job, not the other way around. Modification, once you open up that door, you allow changes in a software which will cause problems, because your systems were inefficient, which is why you're going for an ERP in the first place. So why not implement the new changes? Tighter control and proposed modification, definitely. You should not approve any modifications to the ERP system unless and until it is absolutely necessary and you would not be able to function it. Customizations are something else. Configuration is something entirely different. There was a reading that actually discussed the same thing, where customizations or modifications basically refers to making a major change in the software. Configuration just means setting it up for your organization, putting in the right units, the currencies, the dates, the times, names of the employees, or the organizational structure. That's just configuration, setting the software up for yourself. Modification or customization basically means changing the software. That should not be done. Stronger vendor alliances. Now, another thing that Cisco was lucky with was finding people like Oracle and KPMG as their consultants. Is that replicable? Maybe, maybe not, because not every organization is going to be lucky enough to get good vendors or good alliances with good companies. But is it a success factor? Definitely. Select hungry vendors. Hungry vendors are those who are really interested in trying to get the project working because they want to build up their reputation. Is that a success factor? Not necessarily, but it may be useful to have a company that is really into implementing ERPs, because then they're putting in their best, and that is definitely, that may or may not be replicable a success factor, but that is something that you should try. Financially strong vendors, that does help, but that only helps to a degree. That may not be necessarily. Just because a company is small or the company that's implementing for you is not financially strong doesn't mean that they'll be bad at it. They may still be really good, so that's not much of an issue. Structure of hardware contract, that basically means the kind of contract that you have set up with what computers you'll be getting or what hardware you'll be getting for running these ERPs. This is not a success factor because this is not necessary. Again, it depends on the vendor. Is it replicable? Probably not, because not every vendor is going to be nice enough to say that they will give you the best hardware and they'll keep on updating and maintaining it. So no, it is not something that can be replicated. High level vendor personnel on steering committee, that may or may not be replicable, which basically means having the vendors people on your steering committee. That only depends on your organization's upper management. If they're good enough, if they're sensible enough, they will put them in the steering committee, otherwise they won't. Having seasoned experienced consulting support, that may not be replicable, but that is definitely a success factor. Having good consultants, and these consultants are actually third party people, they're not the vendors, because the vendors will try to push their own software. These are people who've either implemented ERPs in other places or who've had experiences of failures and successes of ERP implementation in their own organization. You pay them a hefty amount to help you do the same. Well-defined project end date, very crucial from the perspective of completing a project. But is it a success factor? Not necessarily, because in most cases the ERP projects tend to extend the supposed deadlines given, but it can be replicated quite often and quite easily. So let's look at the obstacles that Cisco saw and faced and how they overcame them. So one of the biggest problems that they had was poor testing strategy. So during testing, before the system was actually changed to the new one, the transactions from individual departments were given to the system, and they were given to the system sequentially, step by step, instead of being given simultaneously. What they should have done was to give all the data and all of the transactions at the same time, just to see whether the system could handle the strain. And they didn't do that, which is why they later had to face those problems. So whenever you're quality testing your implementation, you need to make sure that you give it the full stress. So operational performance suffered later on, and Cisco agrees that the testing should have been in the more realistic way, instead of just demonstrating it. They should have put in the same amount of data into their system that they would in a real world situation, so as to see whether the system and the people using it could handle it. That was very important. Second, immature software. The software did not provide all the functionality that was required by Cisco off the shelf. So they did choose ERP from Oracle, but it did not have everything that Cisco needed. Now this is in the earlier times. Now things have changed. Now now ERP systems that Oracle gives out are far more superior. However, this shift to this kind of ERP required more of modifications, because Cisco needed them, and they had to manage that. This was difficult. However, given their circumstances, this was the best they could do. Undersized technical architecture. Their hardware was just not good enough, and they also had to actually bring in good and better hardware to solve this problem. So was it a complete success? Depends on how you look at it. You have to look at whether or not they did everything right. So did it get it working? It did started giving them money, but let's look at different things. Was 9 months and 15 million amazing and remarkable? Yes, in general it is, but if you were to look at the breakdown, you'll realize it's not. The $15 million, was it really $50 million? Incorrect, it wasn't. The original $15 million only included the cost for the estimated 20 Cisco people that were in the main team. There were other people that had to be pulled in from other projects that they were working in, so they have to be catered in. So if we were to look at the number of people that they got, so they got about 80 Cisco personnel, so that's 100 minus 20 of the core members, so that's 80 more people for 8 months, and for 160 hours per month that they gave their work, and for $100 per hour that they were engaged in this project, it cost Cisco another $10.24 million US. So this is at the end of the summer. So the IT department had to actually bring in other people from different other projects. So they had to give up those projects, they had to come here. The decommitting of the entire IT department, they were busy with other things, in itself cost quite a bit. There were 100 IT personnel, and about 80% of them were committed to other projects. So 4.5 months were taken away from those projects of the IT people, and they had to be put into this system. And for 160 hours per month at the rate of $100 per hour, this was another $5.76 million. So finally, the hardware vendor was required to take the responsibility of changing the hardware as well. So they had to improve their hardware because it just wasn't good enough for implementing this ERP. So $15 million into 32% of the hardware expenditure that was given in the case studies exhibits, into 50% of the hardware that they had to buy, is another $2.4 million US that would have been avoided had they made a better contract. So technically the total cost overran by a budget of $18.4 million US other than the 15 that they're quoting. So it's quite a bit actually. So that is an overrun of about 122%. So it's 18.4 million plus 15 million US dollars that the total project cost. So it is also very relevant to point out that the investment was relative to the firm size at that time. 15 million of $500 million company is quite a bit, right? So they had to spend quite a bit to actually get this implemented. So was the project success? Yeah, you can decide on your own. It overran the budget, but it did give the end results that Cisco was looking for. Now the bigger question, could they do it again? They probably could. Now that they've learned the lessons, now that they've become more savvy to an ERP implementation, to understanding how and what works and what doesn't, they would probably do it, and probably they'll save more money this time around. So yeah, this is definitely something that they can do. Now let's look at some other problems that they say. Decision making in dynamic business environments. Understand that in the case of the expenditures involved in ERP implementation at Cisco, the company spent a lot more than what was necessary, than what they said that they would, but that happens because they are very complicated projects. They did not have the right hardware, they had to spend that. So you need to understand that they had to go through a justification process for such a huge expenditure, which they probably just didn't do because they needed an approval. So they said it will cost $50 million. It overran that budget, but it happens because it's such a complicated implementation. It may also be the case that the entire formal project justification was to get people to get on board. So they were like, let's just say 50 million, get ahead with it. Plus the CIO leadership. So Peter Solvik started his career at Apple, right? So he and then he learned a lot at Cisco. So he learned quite a bit when he came in over here in Cisco. So Pete's environment and the view of the role of computing with that of CIOs in traditional organization as compared to Cisco is very different. So he had to learn a lot of new things. He had to understand a lot of new things. So CIOs traditional survival skills are trained to be more on the risk averse side. But when he came in over from Apple to Cisco, his responsibilities changed and he had to do a lot of new things. The Big Bang implementation, Cisco implemented their ERP in a Big Bang approach instead of the phased approach. They did it in a single way. I have already discussed that there are several reasons why this may or may not be the right approach. There are advantages to having a more cautious approach. However, in Cisco's case, they had no choice. Project time compression, because I already said so, they had very little time, so they oftentimes squeezed things that they were supposed to do in a week into 2 days, which worked out for them but may not be the most sensible thing to do. So summing up the Cisco case, you need to understand that this implementation was successful for several reasons. It was because this was a new approach. The sales were expected to grow for over $45 billion in the next 5 years. So this was a new thing. 25% of the US companies were already going for ERPs. That's why it made sense. ERP was a big business. It was going to be a $45 billion industry. It was at the same time, this entire project was very complex. There was a high risk because new business processes were coming in. It was a whole new technology. There was a high reward in the supply chain in transparency that would happen after this ERP got implemented. This was a large scale project and took a long while, was very expensive. We already discussed that it was a lot more than the 50 million that they were talking about. People had already tried this and failed. Over 70% was the failure ratio. So Cisco was taking a huge risk by implementing it. And finally, this ERP initiative is in itself a whole new venture. It's not just large re-engineering system projects, it's a whole new way of doing things. So that's pretty much it. So that's the end of the Cisco case study. I hope you will understand better from this. Thank you.